Hi guys, welcome to today's video. In today's video, I'm going to be explaining to you guys one of Figma's newest feature, which is the advanced prototyping with conditional logic and expressions. To explain this concept, I'm going to be using this product detail page, and we are going to be making this add to cart button functional. So basically, once we click on this add to cart button, we get the option to increase the number of items that have been added to cart. So once I click on this plus button or this add button, you can see that the number of items increases by 1. And also that increment shows or displays in our cart icon label up here. So basically, once we keep increasing the number of items, it keeps displaying in our cart icon right here, which is super cool. We can also reduce the number by clicking on this subtract button, and once it gets to 0, we will see that we see our add to cart button back. This is a super cool feature, and all this can be achieved with the use of conditional logic and expressions. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so that you get notified whenever I post a new video. So guys, here is the design of the file we are going to be using for this particular conditional logic. And I created this design in a few videos back where we designed this particular section that shows this image slider animation. If you've not seen this video and you're interested in this image slider animation, I'm going to put the link down in the description so that you can also watch this particular video. But for this particular video, I'm going to be dropping the link to this design file so that you can download this design file and have a template so that you can also go along with the video. So guys, the first thing we are going to do is we are going to have a new design file where we don't have any of these particular functionalities, and we are going to start off from scratch. So in order to achieve that, I've created a new design file up here. It's a blank design file and there is nothing on it. I'm just going to paste in our design that has no prototype or any kind of interaction on it. So here, as you can see, we have two basic frames. We have the add to cart frame and this particular quantity incremental and decremental button where we can increase or decrease the items in the cart. So we are going to take this off very slow and step by step. The first thing we are going to do is to create this incremental functionality where once we click on an add to cart, the number of the items in the cart increases, and then we can click on the plus button and the minus button to increase or decrease. So in order to achieve this, the first thing we are going to do is to create a variable. So there is a new interaction option which is variables. So to be able to use this, the first thing you're going to do is click randomly outside in your design artboard, like the way I'm doing here. You're going to see local variables here, and you can click on this settings open variable button here, and here is a panel where you can configure different kinds of variable. So for us, we can just create a new variable, or we can rename this collection because by default you have collection 1. So I'm going to rename it to, let's say, product variable, for instance. So with this, what we want to start doing is to start creating our variable. I'm going to click on this create variable button, and the first thing we want to create is the number variable because we want to create a number variable so that we can increase the number. So we click on this number variable and the value will be set to 0 by default because here by default you're going to have 0. So once we have this, what we then want to do is to tie these particular numbers here, this and this particular 0 at the top here, to our variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this number icon, and once we have this number icon clicked on, you can come to this position and you can see apply variable, right? So I'm going to click on apply variable to this, and I'm going to select this number variable. Now we can see that this number variable, this 0 right here, is tied to this number variable. I'm going to do the same thing for this particular number here. I'm going to click on this icon that says apply variable and select the number variable. I'm also going to do the same thing for this particular number here. I'm going to click on apply variable, and I'm going to click on this number. So now we've tied this particular number or this text layer to our variable. So guys, once we've successfully tied this zero, all these zeros here, to the number variable we created here, to this number variable, sorry, I'm going to rename this product variable to product interaction instead of product variable so that we don't get confused. So once we've tied all these zero to this number variable we created here, the next thing we want to do is to create an incremental value. So we want a situation where once we click on this plus item, we increase our number variable by 1. So typically what you're going to do is I'm going to select this plus button here, and I'm going to come to our prototype section and click on interaction. So the kind of interaction we want is on click. So what we want is at every click, we want to increase this variable. So we are going to click on set variable. There is a new option here that says set variable. There is set variable, conditionals, and so on. What we want to click on is set variable, and what we want to do is we want to set this number variable. You click on that number variable, you can see it shows number variable here. We want to then say we want to make this number variable, you're going to see we're going to have additional options to select what we want to do with that number variable. In this situation, we want to do an addition, so we're going to click on addition, which is going to write this plus. You can go ahead to use your keyboard to write out the plus yourself. Then we can say number plus 1. Then you can click your enter keyboard or click outside the modal. So here, typically what we are saying is at every click of this plus button, we want to increase this number variable by 1. So after that, we can then quickly click on our prototype so that we can see the prototype of what we just did. And also one of the cool features now in Figma is the InDesign prototype. So you can click on your frame like this, hit shift and spacebar to create a prototype in your design without having to click on the prototype button. I'm just going to expand this a little more so that we can see this properly as the prototype loads. So this is it, guys. You can see that once we click on this plus button, this number variable is now increasing by 1, which is super cool. So now we want a situation where once we click on this minus button, this number variable decreases by 1, which by now you must have guessed how to achieve that. I'm going to select this minus button or this subtract button here. I'm going to create an interaction on it. It's going to be an on-click interaction, and what we want to do is set variable. We want to set this number variable, and what we want to do is set this number variable subtraction, because initially we did addition. Here we want to do subtraction, which is a minus sign by 1. So you can click enter and click outside the box to close your modal, and you can see this little icon that shows that we've set a variable on it. I'm going to click on our frame, hit shift and spacebar to bring up our prototype once more, and now we can increase this button incrementally and use the subtract button to reduce these values. So there is one more thing. As you can see, once we reduce, we can also go to a minus value, which is not what we want. When you have a product cart, you typically don't want to go to minus value. We want it to end at 0. So we want a situation where once this our variable is at the value of 0, we don't want to be able to reduce this value again. So in order to do that, what we're going to use in this particular position is the conditional logic. So what we are going to do for that particular position is once we click on our minus button, we can still go to our on click. So here we set a variable, but we can also add more interactions to this on click. So I'm going to click on more action or add action, and in this situation we want to add a conditional. So for this conditional, what we want to do is once our number variable is equal to 0, we want to be able to not click, or this particular functionality of subtracting 1 that we created at the top, we only want to be able to perform this action when our number value is greater than 1. So typically what we are going to do is write the conditions that says if, click on this section, you're going to see a number of options, and our number variable is one of them. So we'll say if our number variable is greater than 1, right? What we then want to do is to be able to perform this function. So we only want to be able to subtract by 1 if the number variable is more than 1. So I can then click on this set variable that we created initially and drag it into our conditional logic here. So typically what we are saying, if this number variable is greater than 1, we want to be able to subtract it by 1, else we don't want to do anything. So once we have this set up, I can close up this modal, click on our frame, hit shift spacebar to bring up our prototype once more. Now we can increase this and we can then use the subtract button to reduce this. Now you can see that it ends at 1 because we say once it is greater than 1, we don't want to be able to do this, which this particular value, which is 1, is not greater than 1. So what we are going to do is adjust that statement. I'm going to click on this and I'm going to say once this is greater than 0, not 1. So we can have once the number is greater than 0, we don't want to be able to perform that action. So we can check our prototype once more and we can now see that we can increase the value by 1 and we can reduce this until it gets to 0. Now once it gets to 0, if I keep clicking, we can't go to -1 or -2 or -3, which is typically what we want. And because our number variable is also tied to this particular cat icon, I don't know if you guys can see that, but once you click on this, you'll notice that the number in this cat icon also increases alongside other numbers here. So now that we've been able to successfully create our incremental and decremental value, what we then want to do is, I don't want to show this quantity counter until the user have clicked on this add to cart button. And once the user removes every single item from the cart, let's say there is one item in the cart and the user clicks on this subtract button and removes that one item, once it's on 0, we don't want to have this quantity incremental button again. We just want the option to add to cart. So once the user add to cart, we can then let the user start increasing that value. So now we will create this condition and use this condition to display the items of the button we want to display. So once it is 0, we don't want to have this quantity counter. So how are we going to do this? Now there is also a Boolean property. What we are going to do is then click outside our design file, just like we did initially, switch to the design panel here, go to our local variable, click on this settings item. Here we only have our number variable. What we want to do is create an additional variable. And in this case, we want to use the Boolean variable. I'm going to click on this Boolean variable and I'm going to rename it. Now, to be able to achieve this, I'm going to name this Boolean variable, let's say quantity buttons, quantity btn. And by default, I want these quantity buttons to be false because by default, I don't want these particular buttons to show. So I'm going to create this and I'm going to close it up. Now what I want to do is I want to tie this entire layer to this to that particular Boolean property or that Boolean variable that we created. But before I do that, I'm going to select this quantity button and I'll add to cart button and I'm going to hit Shift A on both of them so that I create an auto layout on them. And I will do this so that once this particular Boolean this particular layer is off, we are only going to see one, and once this is off, we can see the next one. You guys will understand that in a bit. So the last thing we did was to create our quantity button. What we want to do now is to tie this quantity button to this particular quantity button layer. So I'm going to click on this entire layer and I'm going to come to this layer visibility section that has this pass through. I'm going to right click on this I button. Once you right click on this I button, you will have a drop down with this Boolean variable that we created earlier that says quantity button. And by the side, you can notice that this quantity button is false. So I'm going to click on this quantity button and you will see by default, we can't see this particular layer anymore because we have tied it to that Boolean variable that is false that we created earlier. And also, if you look at the components section here, you're going to see that the visibility of this component is off. If you turn on this visibility, you're going to remove that connection where we tied the particular quantity button variable to this particular section area, because I have turned on this visibility button. So you will want to make sure you don't tamper with this layer while you're setting or while you are tagging your particular section or elements to a particular visibility, so that it doesn't detach it from what you set it to. But before we go ahead, I'm going to detach the entire frame where we set this auto layout connection between these two cards, which is the auto layout frame that ties these two cards. I'm going to add this frame later in the video, and I'm going to show you why. But just so that we will not create a confusion and set some interaction on the parent frame instead of the individual buttons, I'm going to remove it for now, and I'm going to remove it by hitting Command-Shift-G to detach a frame from its components. Now they are individual components, and we can clearly identify both of them and work on them. So let's go back to what we did initially to tie the quantity button variable to this particular section by right clicking on this I button and clicking on quantity button. So this is where we left off, and what we want to do from here is by clicking on this add to cart button, we want to see our quantity buttons, because by clicking on this add to cart button, what we want to do is to increment the number of items in our cart by 1, and then we will set a condition that once the number in our cart is greater than 0, we want to be able to see our quantity button areas, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So the first thing you're going to do is click on this add to cart button, go to the prototype section and add an interaction to this. So the first interaction we want to do is going to definitely be a set variable. What we want to do here is to set our number variable. What we want to do is add the number variable and increment it, which is to use the addition button, just like we did with the plus button. I want to increment it by 1. So here by default, what we want to do is to increment our numbers of items in our cart by 1 once we click on this add to cart button. So to view that, I'm going to click on this section, hit shift spacebar to prototype this, and I'm going to click on this add to cart button, and you can see on this cart section here there is an increment by 1. So I'm also going to open this particular prototype up on my browser so that you guys can have a proper view of this. So this is what we currently have, as you can see here. Once I click on this add to cart button, you can see that there's an incremental value of 1 on our cart icon here. If I keep clicking on it, you can see it's now 6. So this is what we want. But in addition to this functionality, we now want to go into something called conditional logic. So I'm going to click on this add to cart button, go back to our interaction on it. Here we have an increment of 1, but what we want to do is to add another condition. This condition will let the system know that once our number of items in the cart is greater than 0, we then want to show our counter, our button counter section, which is the quantity button that we set earlier. So to achieve this, I'm going to click on this plus icon that says add action. And what we want to do here is to click on this conditional statement here. I'm going to click on this conditional statement, and it's basically just gives us an if-else statement. What this says is if an action takes place, let something else happen, or if something happens, let us do something else. So in our case, what we want to say is if the number of items in our cart is greater than 0, we want to be able to see, or we want to turn the value of our quantity button to true and make that quantity button section area visible. So to do that, I'm going to click on this if statement, and I'm going to say if our quantity button is greater than 0, you're going to see that condition there that says greater than 0. I'm just going to cancel this so you see it again. If our quantity button is greater than 0, there are other conditions, but in this situation we want to use greater than. So I'm going to click on greater than. I'm going to add 0. So once it's greater than 0, I'm going to click outside to close that up. Here in the body part of this if statement, we want to perform an action. We want to add an action. So here we want to set our quantity button variable property to true. So I'm going to click on this, and here I'm going to say set variable. The variable we want to set is this quantity button, and we want to set it to true. So once we have done this, we are now saying if the number of items here is greater than 0, set our quantity button value to true. We can then close this up, go to our prototype, just like the way I opened it here in our browser, and I'm going to click on this add to cart button, and here we can see our quantity buttons. We can then go ahead to perform other operations that we set to the plus and minus button here, and it's going to work just as fine. So now that we've been able to achieve this, what I want to do is, once the number of items in our cart is greater than 0 and this particular quantity button section is visible, we want to make this our add to cart button disabled. So we don't want to see this add to cart button. We only want to have the ability to increase and reduce the number of items in the cart. So in order to achieve this, what we are going to do is we are going to set another Boolean variable and tie that Boolean variable to this add to cart button. So I'm going to go to our interaction section here, and what we want to do is, while this is greater than 0 and we want to be able to set the visibility of our quantity button to true, we also want to have another action that sets the visibility of this button to false. But then we'll have to then create that Boolean variable first. So we are going to click somewhere around our design, not in any of our design file, switch to the design panel here, go to our local variables that we created, and we are going to create another variable. It's going to be a Boolean variable, and this time we can call it add to cart button. So this is our add to cart button variable, and by default this is true because by default this button in our design is true. So I'm going to check this and I'm going to close this up. So once I do this, I'm going to click on this button, and we are then going to tie this button to that particular variable that I just created. So I'm going to come to this layer section that has this pass through as usual. I'm going to right click on this I button, and I'm going to go to our add to cart button variable section, and I'm going to tie it to it. Now clicking on this button, you can see that it has this add to cart button variable. Now what we want to do is, in our local variables here, once the number of items here is greater than 0, we want to make this invisible. We've already made it possible to see our quantity buttons once it is greater than 0. Now we want to remove our add to cart button once it is greater than 0. So to do that, I'm going to click on this button, and we are still going to be using the interaction on this button because that is the action that makes us increment our number by 1 at first. So I'm going to click on this interaction. We already have a number of statements here, and what I want to do is to add another one, and I'm going to make it a set variable. And for this set variable, we want to talk about the add to cart button, and here we want to change the value of this add to cart to false. So basically what we are saying here now is, once the number of items in our cart is greater than 0, we want to then see, that is, set the visibility of this quantity button to true, and also set the visibility of this add to cart button to false. So I'm going to close this up. Once we have that, I'm going to click on our frame, and I'm going to hit shift spacebar to turn on our prototype, and I'm going to click on this. Now we can see that once our number is greater than 0, we don't see our add to cart button anymore. But then what happens when it is 0? So when it is 0, we want to remove this quantity button here, and we want to display our add to cart button, and that functionality happens only when we click on this particular subtract button. So for instance, I'm going to restart this prototype, and this is the default state, right? Once we click on our add to cart button, we have our quantity counter button that lets us increase the number of items in our cart, but here this subtract button is what lets us decrease the number of items in the cart. So we are going to set that interaction on this subtract button, that once it hits 0 like this, we want to then display our add to cart button and take out this quantity section from our design. So that is pretty easy to achieve. What we are going to need to do is to turn on the visibility of this layer back, this particular quantity button area. We're going to click on our subtract button, and on this subtract button, we want to add an additional statement to the list of interactions that we have here. So Here we already have one condition statement that says if this number is greater than 0, we should have the ability to subtract another number, which is here we are setting number to number minus 1. So what we want to do is to add another condition. Here is going to be conditional, and for this conditional, what we want to say is if this number value is equal to 0, this is another conditional statement we could use, is equal to 0, what we want to do in this situation is to set a variable, and the variable we want to set is this add to cart button right here. What we want to do is we want to set it to true, because at that point it's going to be false once the number of items is greater than 0. So here we are setting the value of our add to cart item to true once the number is equal to 0. So I'm going to close up this tab. I'm going to select this particular frame, hit shift spacebar to bring up our prototype, and as you can guess, or as you've noticed, we have our quantity button section here, which is not supposed to be, which is exactly what we were talking about earlier. I'm going to close up the prototype, and here you can see that it is not tied to the respective variable that we want, which is the reason why we need to be careful detaching these sections while working. So I'm going to select it back, go back to our layer, right click on it, and I'm going to give it this property of quantity button. I'm going to go back to our frame, so I'm going to hit shift spacebar to spin up our prototype, and once I click on add to cart, we can then see our quantity button, and we can increase this value and reduce this value. Once we get to 0, we can see now we see our add to cart section, but we just don't want to see this add to cart button. We also want to make the visibility of this quantity button disabled. We want to set the value of the quantity button variable to false. So I'm also going to go back, uncheck this, click on this subtract icon, go to the prototype, go to our interaction. While we are setting the add to cart button to true, we also want to add another action, which is set variable, and what we want to do is we want to set the value of this quantity button to be false. So we are going to add that particular statement to our if statement. I'm going to close this up. I'm going to click on our frame again, hit shift spacebar. But before I bring up our prototype, so you won't forget, you have to click on this section back, go to the design panel, right click on this eye icon, right click, and tie this section back to our quantity button. If you click on our add to cart button, you see that it still ties to our add to cart button because it is true by default. So I'm going to spin up our prototype with shift spacebar again, and I'm going to click on add to cart. Now we can see this is functioning, and once we hit 0, we are no more seeing our quantity button, which is exactly the functionality we want, and we are almost done. So we've almost completely prototyped our add to cart session. Clicking on add to cart, we have our quantity. We can increase and decrease, and once we get to 0, we don't see our quantity. But I don't like the way these buttons are showing up side by side. How to fix this is with the use of auto layout. So in order to allow our buttons show up on the same spot, I'm going to bring them together or group them together with the use of auto layout. So I'm going to select this add to cart button here, and this component here, which is obviously our quantity button that is set to false by default. I'm going to select both of them and hit shift A on them to create an auto layout. Once I have done that, I can then click on our frames, hit shift spacebar to create our prototype, and you can see this works perfectly. Add to cart, we get our quantity increase, decrease, gets to 0, and we have our add to cart button. We can also preview this on our browser, and it's going to work just as well. We can see this is working perfectly, and you can see the incremental value on our cart here, and we can reduce this, and once it gets to 0, we see our add to cart button. I know this is a lot, and it can be very overwhelming for people who are really new to the whole concept of conditionals and expressions, but I hope I've been able to show you guys an easy way to do this. and I hope you guys learned a lot. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you in my next video.